Vancouver. I was born in Dubai, raised in Vancouver, BC, and my ancestry is of Iranian and Portuguese descent. I share this as my own ancestry and upbringing, like everyone here, informs the way that we not only see the world, but the work that we do. So the Health Design Lab is a research and design center at Emily Carr University and located on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We practice these land acknowledgements not only as acts of recognition, but also to attune ourselves to the real, lived, and material impacts of colonial ideologies. At the Health Design Lab, we use participatory design methods to catalyze, support, and amplify initiatives that address complex health challenges. We have a team of designers that include faculty and students to work collaboratively with people with lived experience on projects that involve storytelling, visualization, and co-design. Through partnerships on these types of projects, we aim to foster new ideas, improve systems and services, and amplify voices of people and their stories. So participatory design, for those who aren't aware, is also called co-design often. It underpins the idea that in order to solve a problem, we fully need to understand someone's experience of the world. And we can only do that through their participation in expressing that experience. So our view is less of a traditional research model or perspective where we study the users or the participants, but rather a more collaborative approach. A process in which facilitation brings participants together to elicit a shared first-hand experience and first-hand knowledge perspectives. So the co-design process recognizes that knowledge that stakeholders bring are both explicit and tacit. Tacit meaning it's not completely top of mind, but something that through engagement and conversation can come out. And so we use creative hands-on tools to draw out this knowledge. So to bring that back to relational ways of working, there are a few key learnings I'm hoping to share with you all today through two projects that we have at the Health Design Lab. So those learnings are encouraging multiplicity of roles, creating safe and brave spaces, we'll talk about this a bit more, co-leading and co-facilitating, considering positionality, so how we see ourselves and view the world, and acknowledging and accessible knowledge mobilization and creating those opportunities. And so the first project I'll be sharing today addresses health inequities and explores the question, how do we deconstruct racism in healthcare by exploring a community-based model for cultural safety education that utilizes material practice as a tool for dialogue? So before I dive into the project, I'm going to share a little bit of a foundation and unpack some terminology for those who are less familiar with decolonization practices. So when we talk about decolonizing, we think about unraveling and unlearning the ongoing colonial mentalities and power hierarchies that are embedded in dominant culture, permeate all institutions and systems of government, and ones that contribute to the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples throughout Canada. So colonial practices such as Canada's residential school system and the 60s scoop forcibly removed and isolated Indigenous children from their families, communities, and traditional lands in order to assimilate them into dominant Canadian culture. The legacy of these policies continue to contribute to the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in child welfare system, in the criminal justice system, and contribute to intergenerational trauma, which has adverse effects on the health of Indigenous peoples. So culturally relevant strategies are needed to create culturally safe environments. Cultural safety is defined here as the creation of an environment that is not only physically, but socially, emotionally, and spiritually safe. To create these spaces, we need cultural humility, which is a lifelong process of self-reflection, of how assumptions, beliefs, and privileges are embedded within individuals' understandings and practices, so that's also needed. So within the Canadian healthcare system, many providers have had limited encounters with Indigenous people outside of their workplace, which contributes to their inadequate understanding of Indigenous peoples' worldviews, lived experience, and the impacts of colonial policy on their health. racism towards Indigenous people in healthcare settings occurs not only at individual, but institutional and systemic levels in Canada. And it's a contributing factor to Indigenous peoples experiencing significantly poorer health outcomes than non-Indigenous people. Current Western healthcare practices based in systems with colonial underpinnings, while the average individual may feel frustrated navigating the healthcare system at certain points in their life, the impact of colonialism disproportionately impacts the Indigenous peoples at a population level. So in 2020, there was a review of Indigenous-specific racism in BC through a provincial healthcare system. It shared that, this was conducted through the Ministry of Health. It was called the In Plain Sight Report, and it indicates current widespread Indigenous-specific stereotyping, racism, and discrimination. So clearly something is lacking, and we have to recognize the limitations of classroom and clinical practice in teaching those pillars, to find methods to move healthcare providers to a place where they can integrate those methods into practice. So our approach to cultural safety education is through cultural immersion in Indigenous knowledge sharing and knowledge practice. It emerges through the work and practice of an Indigenous and design team from Emily Carr University in close collaboration with the College of New Caledonia, which is in Prince George on the Lheidli-T'enneh territory, led by Marlene Erickson, who's the Executive Director of Aboriginal Programs at the college, and Brenda Crabtree, who's the Director of Aboriginal Programs at Emily Carr University. Also on the team, but not with me here, we have many critical team members who contributed to the work in diverse and significant ways, which included an elder, Indigenous artists, designers, non-Indigenous, family physicians, and an Indigenous nurse. Our team started this work about 3.5 years ago with the idea of how art and material practice can foster cultural safety, and for the purpose of these workshops to further validate what was said in that In Plain Sight report that I just mentioned. So currently, most cultural safety education programs are developed specifically for healthcare practitioners or students. So we decided to create a program that would bring healthcare students and Indigenous people together as co-participants for the purpose of shared learning through mutual benefit. Key to that workshop experience has been the inclusion of local artists, knowledge holders, and cultural advisors. Our workshop model includes a 2.5-day workshop for approximately 20 participants, where we strive for an equal distribution between Indigenous community members and healthcare providers. The workshops follow a loose structure and agenda that relies heavily on the makeup of who we bring into the room to facilitate rich and meaningful dialogue and the sharing of experience. The workshop is less of a teacher model, student model, and more of a community coming together to build a sense of community and relationships. And here I've just shared who was involved in the workshop. We have some photos from the in-person one, and we had to do a couple over Zoom during the pandemic. And this just represents kind of the depth of knowledge and people that were involved. And above and that even were participants who were engaged. And so I'm here speaking today on behalf of the team, but there's many, many more that were part of this work. And so I'm now going to briefly illustrate how we understand the different elements of the workshop, with first and foremost centering Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and letting those practices and relationships be the foundation of the way we work, whether that be through the way our team came together, or just broadly valuing the complex interpersonal relationships that occur between everyone within that community and the land that we were on. From within these Indigenous worldviews and approaches, the intent of the workshop was to understand and acknowledge systemic Indigenous racism in the healthcare system with future healthcare practitioners, and looking at how centering Indigenous voices, experiences, and practices can create change within these systems to make space for alternative systems to emerge. I recall when we were applying for a grant to do this work, we were first, a lot of people questioned why a design university was attempting to do something within healthcare, and said, oh, there's other people working in this space. And we wanted to kind of fight back with that and say there's different ways through making and art and practice that allow people to immerse themselves differently in the content that can't be done through an online module or course in that way. So the concepts of embedding learning, brave spaces, and safe spaces are inherent within Indigenous knowledge sharing. So our team took special care to build and bring in local Indigenous protocols of respect. We had Indigenous leaders who were coming from Emily Carr University, as well as Indigenous leaders from Prince George. And we made sure to always defer to local protocol. It wasn't just because we had an Indigenous-led team, it always made sure that Lately Tene was being represented, and we were following those practices as we were on that land. And so we tried to enable students to connect with the real community members, to hear everyday stories and experiences. We found that this can really help to break down prejudices and views of racism. It's not by clicking through an online course or sitting with someone reading through a list of historical facts. It's about creating safe spaces, but more importantly, brave spaces, which, if you haven't heard that term before, it's this idea of safe spaces is an area for comfort, and some people can be complacent in that setting, or feel comfortable and willing to listen but not share. And brave spaces is an idea of challenging that and allowing through a kind of supported environment for people to learn, maybe say the wrong thing, but for it to be moderated in that space so that it's more of a catalyst for change rather than just a retention of knowledge or something that's being shared. And so it was a way to work through those difficult conversations and create those learning spaces that we feel in our hearts and our bodies as well as our minds. So within the learning space, there were 3 categories of methods we practiced throughout the weekend that formed this kind of embodied learning space: hosting and convening, sharing circles, and making. And I'll walk through each of them now. So we'll start off by talking about hosting and convening. So we started the workshop with a brave space agreement, and that's something that has emerged more recently, and I just mentioned a little bit now, but this idea of a list of kind of principles that we went through as a group to agree on it collectively before moving forward with the conversations we had in the workshop. And so it was an entry point to understanding Indigenous methodologies for dialogue and sharing. Methodologies that inherently aim to create safe spaces for discussion by setting the tone of the room and highlighting the importance of culture and tradition as a point of entry into conversation. Bringing Indigenous people and non-Indigenous participants together allowed for their perspectives, experience, and worldviews to be catalyzed in place by providing context and faces to stories and sharing. Sharing circles created structured periods of dialogue led by Indigenous hosts and team members, where everyone in the workshop sits in circle and we each take a turn to speak. If you choose to do so, or just listen, rather than responding directly to what someone was commenting. So sharing circles are inherently intended to be those brave spaces, and we followed that as an Indigenous protocol to build layers of respect. So in this setting, one example we had was there's something different between having a room where everyone kind of just responds, and whoever's top of mind has something to say is more eager, but whoever is kind of maybe on the quieter end doesn't immediately engage. And so the sharing circle allows for everyone to have a moment, and if they want to pass, if they want to say something brief, that's okay, but everyone's attention is focused on the one person sharing, without any words shared responding to it, but knowing that you're being heard. And we had a moment where we had some dental hygiene students from the college who we commented that you don't need to say anything if you feel like you don't want to in the moment. And then they commented as it got to them when they heard some really hard-hitting stories that they said, I wasn't going to say anything, I wasn't going to speak, I don't like public speaking, but I heard the stories that were shared and I couldn't not say something. And so there's something about being in the moment and the words coming to you that's really powerful about the sharing circles. And we recognize as designers coming in that space, we had all these design methods we thought we were going to have and implement, that the sharing circles really achieved the same objective of having people share. And so we step back and we realize, our Indigenous colleagues really have able to create that space, and we don't need to kind of add additional methods to kind of interfere with the power of the conversations that were had. So our knowledge holders also introduced important historical contexts on how Indigenous people and communities are still impacted today by the racism. And so we have some topics that were brought up generally about, Indigenous health being holistic, Western approaches in healthcare being reactive or compartmental. And so these were some themes that came out from our analysis of the results of the conversations that were had in the workshops. And so these sharing circles create space for participants to share and learn from one another, and offered spaces where participants felt safe and welcome to be open and vulnerable and brave enough to share their emotional response with the group. It's one thing to read about racism and abuse. It's another thing to live and listen to a fellow group member talk about how racism impacted their life, impacted the lives of their parents, their grandparents, and the intergenerational trauma that happened. There's some tenseness that happens in your body that cannot happen in the same way from reading that through a textbook or online or a module. So the learning came from hearing each other's lived experience and perspectives, and participants were able to reflect on how this learning felt for them emotionally and physically, and what allyship and advocacy could look like for those individuals. We recognized that students were coming in as second-year dental students, second-year nursing students, and even knowing what intergenerational trauma or decolonial work was sometimes a little bit out of what they learned about prior to that. And we knew that coming in and wanted to kind of meet the students wherever they were at and pick them up and share enough, foundational knowledge with them on the very first day that they kind of, were hit hard a little bit with what the realities were, and slowly over time, started their own learning journey, knowing that different people would come in at different points. And the workshop was only one point where we were interacting with them, and their kind of learning would develop over time. And we checked in with them 6 months later and had an exhibit for some 3 years later from when we initially met them, and others within the same year. And so the next section, which is, I think, really important, so we had those sharing circles, which were really about having dialogue verbally, but making was equally important in the workshop. And so I'll share the thoughts of Connie Watts, who's the Associate Director of Aboriginal Programs at Emily Carr from the project team. So making offered participants both a space to rest and reflect on the sharing circles, balance of making, the rest and reflection, the structured and unstructured conversations created necessary conditions for introspection, learning, unlearning, and healing. Making creates that environment that stimulates dialogue. Through making activities, participants connect and learn from Indigenous artists and their peers through formal and informal moments. We wanted to balance those hard-hitting conversations with an opportunity for those who participated to really release that in a way through making, and not have to immediately respond to those sitting beside them, but have Indigenous material practice continue in that kind of moment of cultural immersion, from sharing circles being an Indigenous approach to making being traditional as well. And so not inserting design methods or other approaches that kind of brought people out of that sense of cultural immersion, but making sure that we were keeping that thread all the way through. And also hosting the workshops at the Prince George Native Friendship Center, and not in a hospital setting, not in a school, not in a university. All those little moments were quite intentional. And so the making created an environment that stimulated dialogue. And like I mentioned, we had those in informal and formal moments. And it offered tangible connections to the land and traditional Indigenous practices, and knowledge holders from our community as well. And so we had guest artists that came in who spoke about how you would smoke the hide, and then the process around that, the histories with her mom of doing that, and then would bring pieces to then make pouches out of or work with beading. And so it created a little bit of connection beyond just the material to how much effort and sense of community came to even have those materials there on that day. And so the projects that we had during the workshop, you'll see some rattles here. We also had tufting, we had beading, we had drum making, which will come up a little bit later. They weren't meant to be completed over the workshop. The point wasn't to teach a skill and have someone come out with a designed or a artistic piece at the end of it, with except for a final drum. The drum had to be soaked overnight, and so there was no taking that one home. It had to be completed in the 5 hours, but everything else was something to just get them started, get an understanding of Indigenous culture and material practice, and have that opportunity of that artifact being something that's reminiscent of their experience. And every time they come back to it after the workshop, it's an opportunity to keep thinking through those conversations and really connect that to a physical object. And so here, the materials used in the making are sustainably linked to Indigenous culture and ways of being, as well as building a connection to community and place. And so that's the drumstick that we made and the drum beside it. And this was Yvonne, who's our local artist, who joined. So we had Indigenous artists and teachers share their deep knowledge that opened the dialogue between the participants to build that sense of community and relationship over the weekend. And so traditional practices like beadwork, caribou hair tufting, and rattle making sessions create an environment to cathartically unpack and give relief to the heavier topics that were brought up in those sharing circles. And this was Violet, who created this amazing squirrel, and she had never beaded before, and we were shocked. And this was just, she finished this months after the workshop, definitely not during, but it just was an example of her connecting back to her culture and having an opportunity to then talk with her family about it and reconnect in a new way. And we acknowledge that Indigenous practice was new for a lot of the nursing students and some of the dental students, but even for the Indigenous participants, it was a reconnection to their culture. Because of the intergenerational trauma of residential schools, parents, grandparents didn't want to talk about what was happening. And so the generation that was now, doing nursing or doing dental or, at that university level, participating in classes, didn't have that connection to culture in the same way. But this workshop, where we had Indigenous leads, allowed for an opportunity for those students to re-engage with culture in a new way that they didn't have the opportunity to have before. So the lighter making brings up participants together through problem solving and sharing. And so the lighter making in this sense means not the drum making, but small kind of navigating through the tufting. And it's very difficult, I will say that, but a good entry point, especially the rattles, to making where everyone could feel successful in what they were doing. The drum making, however, took a tenacity that really exhausts your body and brought the best laughters and stories. There was, there's one student I remember that was trying to string their drum and got one loop that they didn't quite make. You'll see it in kind of this picture. There's little holes that are made all the way around, and they missed one loop, and it takes about 2.5 hours to string, and you're like pulling, and it's deer hide, right? So the holes keep closing as you're trying to pull the stringing through, and they missed one and unstrung their entire drum. And it was just this moment of like, okay, let's rally together to try to like help you finish this in the moment. And it just was this balance of, trusting, having trust in the process, and recognizing that not everything's a mistake. Sometimes things are meant to happen. And I think some of that learning came out through the workshop. So a nursing student said, doing the drum making ourselves is a whole new aspect, because you learn it's not just about cultural safety, but by participating in it, you're learning cultural safety in a different way. It's not just about hearing it, you're doing it. And so actually this was the student that restrung their drum. So this is Nicole, who was lovely and helped her do it and stayed many hours past our initial time to support her. So we have another quote from our participant that said, one participant said they gifted the drum to their dad. He was so happy and proud. "You made this? For my dad to talk is hard." And he opened up when I gave him the drum, told me to talk to my grandma while she's still here. It was that opportunity to make that connection to then the heritage. Making creates an opportunity for many participants to connect with their culture and to material practice resources that are hard to access, particularly in small communities, as they're incredibly expensive. And we were really fortunate to have this grant. Technologies, you think in dental program and nursing and imaging, there's a clear want to invest in money into those technologies, but there's a good argument to say that this is worth the investment as well. So there was a relief and pride when participants finished their drums, and it really brought everyone together, reminding us of an integral Indigenous teaching: we are all one. And so this was from our very first workshop that happened in February 2020, right before the pandemic. And we were really excited that everyone had a chance to finish their drum over 5 hours. And so we worked on many of the projects you saw pictures of, each specifically chosen to match the pacing, mood, and conversations of each day. And so here you'll see a kind of rhythm go by and the kind of ebb and flow of different methods, and that being a way of not being too restrictive or structured, but this idea of immersion happens over time and people can experience it in different ways. So the general rhythm of each of the 3 days involved the 3 methodological components I just shared, which was hosting and convening, where a diverse group of people came together in a shared space with moments of sharing a meal or intentional breaks in the programming. We also had the sharing circles, which I talked about, which was an opportunity for learning, unlearning, active listening, and sharing, and making, which we just talked about, which was an embodied experience of connecting to culture, cultural practices through material practice, through a shared experience. And so during and following the workshops, we had an opportunity to meet with the participants and talk with them about what they felt the biggest impacts of the workshop were. We heard participants talk about the learned awareness of the impacts of systemic Indigenous racism, both within the healthcare setting and within the broader community. Participants were struck by the statistics and stories of lived experience, revealing inequities, both historic and current, and talked about their own gaps in knowledge, reflecting on their individual privileges, blind spots, and assumptions. One participant said in the workshop that the workshop showed the extent of trust that has been broken between Indigenous people and the healthcare system. Another said, "I can't get these statistics out of my head. These statistics were so heavy, and I felt heartbreak after hearing them." The workshops also facilitated connection to local Indigenous culture and community. Participants build relationships with Indigenous elders, artists, and students through both structured and unstructured conversations. These kind of culturally immersive experiences shift away from a deficit-based perspective of Indigenous culture, and Indigenous participants were able to share a spectrum of themselves and their stories as present, embedded, and engaged members of their nations and communities. Learning came from hearing each other's lived experience and perspectives. These face-to-face group conversations both created a learning space that didn't feel detached, like traditional lecture-based learning, but rather built a sense of trust and accountability. Engagement with Indigenous people, not patients, created an opportunity for mutual respect. And so one participant said, "Local Indigenous artists help the making feel more meaningful, understand the cultural impact more. It felt special to be included in these traditions." Another participant said, "Hearing everyone's stories, it's not just a voice. You can see their face, see their emotion, feel the emotions, which makes the connection that much stronger." And the workshops also demonstrated complexity of Indigenous practices, materials, relationships, and the need to do these learnings in supportive relational ways. So we talk in various ways about challenging the notion that Indigenous making is a simple craft, or that racist attitudes and behaviors are in the past. There are rich and complex relationships to the land, storytelling, and each other in all of these practices. So a participant mentioned, we are trying to challenge the notions that are, read that one already. It's easier to learn about the complexity as a group, to appreciate the knowledge of the people helping us to guide us through it. So, and finally, the participants expressed a real sense of empowerment and an understanding of not just systemic impacts of racism within healthcare settings, but also where they sit within those systems and how they might be able to respond. The combination of these elements and themes left participants feeling grateful for the workshop and able to see themselves and their practices as being a part of change. So this quote sums it up. Cultural safety is something that you can't really learn in an 8-hour course. You have to learn through hearing these stories. Just knowing that I can go back to my class and share this with them and try to make an impact to them feels really important. And so through this project, as designers coming from Emily Carr, we challenged the epistemology of design methods and the role of designers on the team, which really translates to all other, others working in policy or government, and many of you here today. Through planning these workshops and this project, our team has learned a lot that is transferable to other projects and teams, mostly in regards to how we work together. First and foremost, we have discussed how important it is to always defer to local protocol and local community and their cultural leadership. Even though we have Indigenous leaders like Brenda and Connie on the team, we always deferred to Marlene, as she was the one from Prince George, and within an academic institution leading Aboriginal programs at the college. And so at each phase, we made sure that we were guided by the local community, local artists and team members, their elders, their stories, and their protocols. If this workshop was held in a different community, it would look different and it would have a different community-based approach. And so we thought about this idea of being propellers, this idea of designers being in this space and just helping move the conversations forward, knowing that as non-Indigenous team members, the conversations wouldn't hit us in the same way that it would the Indigenous team in that moment, and knowing that we had to hold space, we had to help with all the coordinating and navigating and getting the food and those sorts of secondary elements, and just allowing for our Indigenous team to really be present in the moment and kind of feel. And so that was one thing that was really an interesting balance between helping, create the research model, creating the workshop model, but then being present in the actual workshops themselves. The roles always seem to pivot a bit. The designers melted as wallflowers kind of in the back, and we really wanted to make sure that it was an Indigenous-led approach in the moment. And that comes back to this idea of conveners and this idea of bringing people into the space and then learning when to step back and not making it about us. We led this project at Emily Carr. It wasn't about that. It was really about supporting the local community and making sure that their people, we were building capacity for them and that they were the ones whose voices we were amplifying. Another interesting thing with this too was this idea of documenters and synthesizers. I'm a huge data person, and so for me it was trying to figure out how do we incorporate the research component, the part where we're recording information and translating it back into a way that we could share with the community. It became so obvious from the first workshop that we held that we couldn't be recording people in that moment. Of course, that would just be entirely inappropriate in that setting. Even having a laptop present and documenting while people are sharing these incredibly emotional experiences was not appropriate. And so I remember Connie sitting with me and having a conversation as I was, conflicted in how I was going to contribute as a researcher on this project. And she really said, your role is as a witness. And a witness in this setting was someone who ears are open, you're listening, and whatever you take home after that and are able to document and write down, that was enough and what was important. It wasn't about word for word, absolutely making sure that we had everything documented. It was letting that sit and letting us have a moment to kind of collect ourselves and as a team have a conversation after the workshop to recall the experiences that we have and record that session that was outside of the workshop itself. And in terms of a synthesizer, and so that's a person working through the information to share back, I acknowledge my limitation, and this is where positionality comes out again, of the way that I interpret information or read information is only based on my past experiences, education, and the way I would interpret a data set, or in this case, the conversations we've had, will be quite different in some ways than others. And so we made sure that we had a diverse team and we had Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers on the team synthesize that information so that it wasn't a singular lens that we were then sharing and transcribing back to the community. And so one of the questions we asked was, how might we create a suite of resources that enhances the accessibility and reach of knowledge mobilization efforts? And we did this through thinking about it in 3 ways. One was through the typical academia research route, where we're writing a paper and publishing it. We did that through writing a paper for the Design Research Society and presented on that in June. I'll share some highlights here, and so happy to share this document with anyone. We did also recognize that this is great for people who are looking and actively to engage in this work at a quote-unquote professional level, and whatever that means. But we wanted to make sure that the community, the people who were involved and engaged, also were able to access and have that knowledge in a way that felt more accessible than a research paper with certain jargon and dialogue that required a different level of understanding to interpret. And so we also held an exhibit as one of our main knowledge mobilization pieces at the end of the project, and it's still going actually up until Monday. This is at the Two Rivers Gallery up in Prince George, and these are just some photos. And the idea behind the exhibit was really to give something back to the local community. The exhibit wasn't at Emily Carr in Vancouver, it was in the community that we did the workshops, and it really highlighted the stories as well as the physical artifacts from those workshops. We reached back out to students, we invited everybody that participated to join. It was really an opportunity to celebrate the work that was done, but also create a moment for connection and reconnection. And then lastly, knowing that the exhibit is only for a short period of time, we created this publication that is both digital and in print that really highlighted the stories and conversations that were had in an editorial format. And so it included poems, essays, photos, and quotes. And again, I can share the online link to this as well. And it really was meant to provide an opportunity to take some of the pieces from the exhibit, take some of the pieces from the research paper, and also have some personal essays from the students who participated and were willing to share their thoughts in the broader community in one place. And we really tried to kind of think about it in this 3-pronged approach to sharing back the knowledge. And so our goal now is, how might we now grow the Cultural Connections workshop model to engage more communities? And so now, as that grant is over, we're looking to now find new organizations that are hoping to engage in this work through this Indigenous-based model. And so if anybody is interested in chatting about that more, I'd be happy to talk to you about it or share more resources. That's where it's going next. And here I just wanted to, before I share the next project, I wanted to conclude this project with a few words from Marlene Erickson, who's a project leader and executive director of Aboriginal programs at the College of New Caledonia.
In conclusion, we're very excited about the positive outcomes of this way of teaching. It demonstrates how building relationships is foundational to changing attitudes and building networks of support. And these key teachings.
Okay, I'm going to try playing it again. I'm seeing.
Really can be taught in those classrooms.
Okay, I think I need to turn my volume all the way up. Marlene has a soft tone voice as well, so
In conclusion,
Yeah.
we're very
Okay.
excited about the positive outcomes of this way of teaching. It demonstrates how building relationships is foundational to changing attitudes and building networks of support. And these key teachings are not being taught and really can't be taught in most classrooms. Further, it draws on local knowledge holders, so there's no shortage of expertise, especially when you consider that most specialist care requires rural to urban travel. It is important for health professionals in these regional and urban centers to foster relationships and give the parents the courage to reach out and build those relationships and supports when they get home. Cultural competency, or as our elders call it, gentle hands, is a critical component of improving the health outcomes of Indigenous peoples, probably as important as the medical knowledge students learn. And we hope workshops like this one will instill those skills so the participants will carry them into their professional practice and beyond. Nina Shafia, thank all of you. You have honored us.
All right. And so now the next project that I'll share today aims to talk about reducing stigma and explores the question, how might we amplify the voices of people with lived experience of mental health, substance use, and the criminal justice system to reduce stigma? So throughout this year, we have partnered and collaborated with BC Mental Health and Substance Use Services on an animated video series project, which focuses on hearing the perspectives of people with experiences and challenges within this space, with the goal of reducing stigma through storytelling. And so the video project was completed over the span of 6 months with a team of Health Design Lab designers, staff from the partner organization, and people with lived experience. This 3-part animated video series brings you along a journey into the stories of people who bravely share how stigma in the healthcare system has impacted their lives, and what has helped bridge these gaps, and as well as what their hopes for the future are. And so these videos are part of a larger initiative called Understanding Each Other Together, called Unite, and that's the project. A journey into our experiences of stigma to celebrate diversity and create change. And so that's led by the BC Mental Health and Substance Use Services. And here you'll just see a couple stills, or a few stills of summarizing each of the videos. I'll show one of them at the end, that's 6 minutes, but again, if you're interested in seeing the others, they're on our website at the Health Design Lab as well. And so when we think about challenging stigma and creating a supportive environment for people to engage in this work, it's important to consider trauma-informed practices in the process of the work that we do, not just in the outputs. And so the workshops, we aim to create a space for healing, not just extraction of knowledge. And through that, it was important to create a sense of safety, trust, and transparency, as well as empowerment and choice. And those are really the pillars of trauma-informed design that we consider. As part of this as well, peer support was really integral. And so BC Mental Health hired what they called strategic advisors and embedded them within the team. And so there was a couple people who themselves had lived experience and were just as much team members as were the designers, as were the partners. It wasn't meant to just engage them at a volunteer level for a couple hours as a consult and thank them for the time. They were embedded in every session and throughout the process, and really not only a resource for our team to learn from, but really were the ones leading the storytelling sessions, where the designers, again, similar to the other projects, knew when to step back and just be listeners. This was very similar in this context as well. It was about being active listeners, but not ones leading the conversations, and knowing when you need to invite other people into the room to really lead those or co-facilitate the sessions. And that allows for the people who are sharing their stories to really not only feel like they're heard, but understood. And empathy only goes so far, but when you haven't experienced something yourself, knowing how to respond in that moment can be challenging, and you don't want to say the wrong thing. And so allowing for people who have that lived experience to be like, I got you, I understand, and respond is really powerful. And so the other aspect we had too was, how do we actually do the storytelling? And so these were done over Zoom, just because this was kind of still with pandemic restrictions, but we wanted to create an environment where people felt comfortable. And so there was a comfort agreement similar to a Brave Space agreement from the other project that was created and agreed upon during that session. These were recorded, but we made sure to do consent of, people were agreeing to tell their stories before they had even told it yet. And so we acknowledged that we would check in with people throughout the process. If there was anything that they end up saying, they could stop and say that they wish that wouldn't be put into the final videos. And we made sure we went back and forth in that process. And so the process of creating the videos was really co-designed, right from the mapping of storyboarding of the illustrations to what the themes of the videos were. All of it was really open and emergent right from the beginning, and not having a very prescriptive approach to, hey, we wanted you to talk about stigma, tell us the 3 things that are top of mind. It really wasn't about that. It was really about engaging with people, building a relationship with them, making sure that they felt safe in the conversations that they were having, and having trust in us that we would share back the stories in a way that they felt comfortable with. And so these were a couple illustrations from the student who was on this project, Venetia, representing each of the storytellers in the videos. And here we have one of the example of one of the initial animation sessions of sharing some of the preliminary ideas. And so this was with the strategic advisors, storytellers, our team, and the partner organization. And so what I'll share now is one of the videos. And so it's about 6 minutes. So this is the one about stigma.
Is when you fail to see the person, you instead see your stereotype of the person and treat them accordingly. The problem with mental health and addiction for me is that the stigma that's associated with it really ties into who you fundamentally are as a person. And when the stigma is so entrenched in our society, it starts to become something that I've believed about myself. So it is still to this day so hard for me to separate societal stigma from personal shame. And I think that's where it gets dangerous, because it makes people feel like they're not deserving of help.
The stigma around that I've faced on a personal level is this inability to trust. And it goes both ways. For me, the stigma in my life is that my actions and my outward reactions to different life circumstances has been a path of using substances to numb the hurt, the pain, the shame, the guilt. By my actions, I've painted myself into this box. And, the stigma of others is remember when you did this? I just don't trust that you'll be able to actually stay clean. For me, it's wearing what feels to be like a dirty coat of mental health and substance abuse. Society has looked at my outward actions in coping with life and has labeled me as somebody that's not trustworthy, that isn't capable of success, that I come with huge risk.
People don't listen to you, they just look at you. I've dealt with stigma on all different levels. Even now, my life has gotten so much better in the last year. I still have people talk down to me when I go into stores, or just are super, super rude to me, even if I'm extremely nice. And it's been like that my whole life. People categorize people just by the way they look without even actually getting to know them.
I remember the stigma I felt as I'm in a mental health crisis, in psychosis, believing the world's out to kill me, and I'm in handcuffs. I don't trust the RCMP. I don't trust the hospital staff. People looking at me, people staring at me, people seeing me in handcuffs, and just assuming the worst case, that I'm a criminal. that I'm someone who is a harm to society. Meanwhile, not knowing who Chris was as a person.
You know, if someone gets cancer, breaks their leg, or has diabetes, people don't blame the person. And yet with things like substance use disorder and mental illness, you know, there is this propensity to look at it from the outside and go, well, you chose that, right? Like, you chose to put that in your body. You choose to not get out of bed, not cook for yourself, not shower, not work. The only way I could really reconcile myself with this was to look at myself as a young girl full of nothing but potential and say, would she ever have wanted this? Would she ever have chosen this for herself? The answer is no.
I remember being a little kid, and unfortunately, though, I thought being bad was cool. And yeah, I lived in a complex in Toronto. I thought it was the coolest being around people with weapons and selling drugs. Unfortunately, that fueled my life for the last 29 years. Like, I grew up thinking that that stuff was the good thing and the cool thing, and like, I got into that so young that I never knew any other thing. I put in applications when I was young as like a paper boy, pizza shops and fry stands. People just didn't trust me anyways, and they always treated me like I was a little hoodlum, so then I always just acted like one and thought it was cool. Now, almost 30 years later, I've been trying to distance myself from that so much.
I feel like I can't show weakness, because if I show weakness, then I'll be judged for it. Because of all that's happened in my life, that if I'm not crossing every T, dotting every I, being perfect, being flawless, in my perfectionist view of trying to overcome this, I get stuck in this self-defeating trap of being perfect, which is unrealistic, and it would always lead me back out down a path of self-destruction, because I just can't be perfect. I'm a human being. I make mistakes. I mess up.
The biggest myth that I've seen and experienced is that if you're actively addicted to drugs, that you're not then credible, you're not trustworthy, you're not honest, you're not reliable, you're not anything really. And that's a good chunk of the reason why I was a bad person. I was addicted to drugs for a very long time, and the only way that I could get by is if I was a mean person.
I often hear that it's weak-minded individuals who struggle with addiction, and that's not the case. When I'm in a state of mental crisis, or when I'm in a place where I've relapsed, it hurts my heart, and that just fuels continued use, and the snowball effect happens. A myth that I tell myself is that I'm worthless, and I'm not worthy to have a future, which is a lie. I'm very capable, I'm very skilled, I'm talented, I'm lovable, I'm a life worth saving.
There's a lot of good people, and they're not just drug addicts, they're not just homeless. They're mothers, daughters, sisters, brothers, fathers, and they all have stories too.
That was one video out of 3 that we have. Oh gosh. Got me into YouTube. 1 second. Oh, where did the mouse go? Here we go. 1 sec. Work? Okay, great. And so this is one video out of the 3, and I just want to highlight that the illustrations and the video is the output of it, but equally important to that has been the process of the stories. And it makes me emotional almost thinking about it too, of hearing those stories again. And one quote that we had from this was, you know, all of this was integral to finding my voice. And so what they shared at the end couldn't have been possible without the process and what had been implemented to allow for an environment for that voice to be shared. And so with that concludes kind of the 2 projects that I was hoping to share about relational ways of working. And I just wanted to highlight the points that I mentioned at the beginning once more. The point about encouraging multiplicity of roles, so acknowledging that members of a project team can hold multiple roles. It's more about building a sense of community and connection as people, and learning and leaning into people's strengths beyond what their job title is. Creating safe and brave spaces, moving from a place of comfort, as we talked about, to a place where tough conversations can take place in supporting learning environments. Then we had co-leading and co-facilitating, acknowledging that empathy can only go so far, and having people who are content and context experts, whether that be in mental health and substance use from a professional capacity, or through lived experience advisors on the project teams as they're experts of their own experiences. Considering positionality, so the notion that personal values, views, and location, time, and space influence how we each understand the world, and acknowledging that and its influence on the work that we do. And lastly, creating opportunities for accessible knowledge mobilization, whether that's through video outputs, whether that's through holding an exhibit, whether that's a research paper, just finding the ways that the community in which you're engaging with can access that knowledge in a way that's useful for them and to share back. And I just want to thank all of the team members that were on both of these projects, and just wanted to list them all here to know that I'm just one person, but there's many people that were involved in this space. And thank you all for staying with me for the full hour. And if you have any questions about anything that has happened, we can discuss now. And you can also check out our website, Instagram, Twitter, and our website, which has lots more resources and access to the videos and publications. So thank you.